for this talk about intersectionality, critical race theory, and weaponizing language. This is a recorded version of the presentation that I'm going to be doing during our Equity Lunch and Learn. And I am not an expert in intersectionality, critical race theory, or in linguistics or group dynamics. I'm an English teacher, and I am interested in equity, and I'm interested in these topics, and I am presenting these topics during a lunch meeting. So take this with that grain of salt. This is a discussion that is absolutely fraught and absolutely one of those core polarizing discussions of our current day. I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's one that's worth looking into, and I hope that this is not yet another long video on CRT and intersectionality that doesn't get watched. So let's get into it. Critical race theory is best understood, as in clearly understood, after reading about it or watching a presentation that usually takes between 30 minutes to an hour to really grasp the concepts being presented. This sucks because there isn't a great, concise way to discuss the entirety of CRT. It ends up being defended poorly and attacked effectively. So people don't usually have 30 minutes to watch a lecture or read articles on CRT, but they do have 5 minutes to listen to sound bites, either poorly explaining it by watering down the complex discussion or intentionally misrepresenting it. We have a problem with critical race theory in this country, and that problem is it's complex enough to be difficult to present, and it's complex enough to be easy to attack. So this makes it a difficult tool to use in the fight against actual systemic racism. However, it's perhaps one of the most powerful tools in that fight because it gives language that allows everyone involved to get into the work of dismantling racist structures by identifying them more clearly in their own lives, in their experience, and in the way that they interact with other people. So that said, rather than look at the entirety of CRT, we're going to focus on one aspect that's being consistently misrepresented in media today. So we could easily do an entire series on critical race theory and not just one lunch. The reality of the theory, the bastardization of it, and the goals and outcomes of CRT in education and society. But for the sake of time, we're going to look at one part that gets a lot of hate and vitriol, and that's intersectionality. So what is intersectionality? We're going to watch a short video here explaining what intersectionality is before we go on.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberle Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
All right, so that is an absolute crash course in intersectionality. And like I said at the beginning of this, anything that you can watch in maybe 2 minutes is just enough time to get enough information to be dangerous, but not necessarily enough time to get enough information to defend it. So, as teachers, we're looking at this through the lens of education. The three methods of pursuing intersectionality, as expressed in that video, are listening to others, examining our own privilege or power dynamics, and asking questions about who might be excluded from our work. The question I'm going to pose in our meeting is, how are we as teachers called to do this work in our own classrooms and methods? I would argue that if you're following the Danielson framework for education and you're looking at the four different areas in which educators are generally measured as successful, listening to others is an important part about creating a classroom environment where people feel safe. Examining our own privilege or power dynamics is also an important part about that classroom environment. And asking questions about who might be excluded from our work, that's the heart of free and appropriate education, and providing that education to everyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what their individual needs might be. So we do a lot of this work in education already, but what intersectionality does is it formalizes those questions, and you're looking at a person through many different lenses and many different potential power dynamics and interactions. Let's go on and hear more about it from the person who came up with it, Kimberle Crenshaw.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
All right, so that's Kimberle Crenshaw talking about how intersectionality is a prism for understanding types of problems. I think that one of the core caveats for understanding intersectionality, and really for understanding the challenge of presenting intersectionality in our deeply polarized moment, is her description of identity. Crenshaw describes identity as expressed as relational. It's your history, it's your community, it's the institutions that you operate within, and it's in a large part determined by the power dynamics and the surrounding context of who you are. So your identity is an expression of your context and your history. Now, my question here for teachers, and I'm really interested to hear this conversation, and it would take multiple lunches to have the whole conversation, is how does the concept of relational identity challenge or support your own personal concept of identity? And my spoilers here are that this is the question at the heart of the conflict between the Dems and the GOP philosophically as well. You really should Google her TED Talk. It's 18 minutes long. If you have 18 minutes, you can watch that TED Talk and no longer feel like intersectionality is a bad word or a scary word. She really just kind of dispels any kind of myths that you may have heard about it in that 18-minute TED Talk. Okay, so why does CRT get misinterpreted? And this is, I think, some of the more interesting part of how we talk about weaponizing language. So CRT and intersectionality get called Marxist and racist often online. Why is that? Marxism in this case is being simplified into any conversation that's about socioeconomic inequality or group dynamics. The parts of intersectionality that get called Marxist are intersectionality's ability to discuss socioeconomic inequality as a part of group dynamics. What I'm saying is a poor white person and a poor black person both have their poverty in common, though the black person also has the history of racism in the United States as an added degree of oppression. And that oppressor and oppressed dynamic is also a dynamic that is considered Marxist, though it goes beyond Marx. Marx wasn't the only person to ever point out that there are oppressors and there are oppressed, or that there is a group of people who could be considered to be a ruling class. We've had that since fiefdoms. Now, CRT gets considered racist, and that's being used to describe any conversation that acknowledges white privilege or attempts to recognize systemic racism. So when CRT gets called Marxist, it's an oversimplification of socioeconomic inequality and group dynamics. And when CRT gets called racist, it's because it's asking people to acknowledge the existence of white privilege or the existence of systemic racism. So why call CRT Marxist? Calling CRT Marxist is part of a long history of dismissing civil rights action or theory as communist, anti-American, or socialist. By attaching a term like Marxist that's poorly understood but is clearly an enemy word to CRT, it can be dismissed as something not to be investigated by members of the American Conservative Party. This is an excellent example of using dehumanizing language as well. If CRT is Marxist, and I'm a conservative, I'm not going to research CRT because it is Marxism, and anything that I read about while reading about CRT is tinted with the Marxist lens. So I'm going to be incapable of separating the concepts of CRT and intersectionality from this boogeyman of Marxism. It's a very intelligent way to get people to dismiss CRT. So why is CRT called racist? Calling CRT racist is the more interesting misrepresentation to me, and I believe it's aimed at stopping people on the left from researching CRT. The hope, I think, is that Democrats who hear CRT being called racist will avoid it for fear of being racist themselves. So this to me is a sign of how deeply potent CRT is as a tool for advancing racial equity, and that both the left and the right are targeted whenever it's being pushed back against. For it's important also to note how much opposition to CRT argues that white men are the primary victims of CRT, and the argument is generally that white cisgender men have the least oppression in the system of CRT, which is a deep oversimplification because a white cisgender man could be poor. A white cisgender man could be outside of a union and be a non-union worker and have no representation in a power dynamic with their boss. The danger of intersectionality in our political discussion, in our political discourse, isn't that it is racist and it isn't that it is Marxist. The danger is that it allows people to recognize power dynamics that are causing harm to a huge group of people in the United States. That really crosses a lot of different lines. So some examples of pushback against CRT that really showcase the specific language that I've given you examples of, that Marxist and racist language. The first one, and I apologize for this link being a Yahoo link. I usually try to keep it to the AP or Reuters or YouTube, but this is really the best place I found this video, is from former President Donald Trump speaking for 2 minutes on the topic of CRT. So listen to the language that he uses to describe CRT.
The narratives about America being pushed by the far left and being chanted in the streets bear a striking resemblance to the anti-American propaganda of our adversaries, because both groups want to see America weakened, derided, and totally diminished. Students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine, holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It's being imposed into workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. A perfect example of critical race theory was recently published by the Smithsonian Institution. This document alleged that concepts such as hard work, rational thinking, and the nuclear family and belief in God were not values that unite all Americans, but were instead aspects of whiteness. This is offensive and outrageous to Americans of every ethnicity, and it's especially harmful to children of minority backgrounds who should be uplifted, not disparaged. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words.
All right, strong words. So CRT is not only anti-American, it weakens America, it's Marxist, racist, it will divide us, it's anti-rational thinking, religion, and anti-white, and it's harmful to children of minority backgrounds, and it's child abuse. So all strong words, but also all incorrect. CRT is a tool for looking at power dynamics. And the fact that it has garnered so much concern is, I think, probably one of the best examples of the fact that it's effectively looking at those power dynamics. So here's the Heritage Foundation on CRT, and listen to the language that they use when they're talking about CRT, and consider the racist and Marxist common dismissals.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the...
I'll stop her there. While we still have We Are Trained Marxists, Black Lives Matters leftist agenda still up on the screen as well, because I feel like it's pertinent. Dismissing civil rights action as socialist or Marxist is as old as William F. Buckley Jr. and James Baldwin debating in the 60s. Like, dismissing civil rights action and dismissing indeed any pushback against white supremacy as in some way necessarily Marxist or socialist and not American is really telling. And part of what makes CRT scary for people who benefit from white supremacist structures is that it's really effective. It's a really effective way to talk about those structures and how they have caused harm and do cause harm, and to the many different ways and directions that harm is caused. One more, the governor of Florida recently spoke out against CRT. Last one.
Governor DeSantis yesterday to call out one particular ideology.
And I don't know if some of you guys have seen this critical race theory. It's basically teaching kids to hate our country and to hate each other based on race. It puts race as the most important thing. I want content of character to be the most important thing.
So what is critical race theory?
To answer that, I reached out to Dr. Francisco Valdez of the University of Miami. He's a constitutional law professor, and he's done extensive work on this subject. Dr. Valdez, can you explain that theory for those who may not have heard of it?
Critical race theory is an effort by many different scholars in many different disciplines aiming to uncover and understand how identity organizes law and society.
He said it's something that teaches kids to hate this country. What's your reaction to that characterization?
So the whole curriculum is already whitewashed. I would just observe that it's a case of projection. The governor is performing what he is at the same time decrying.
So is this theory even
All right, so to translate the academic there, the governor is performing what he's at the same time decrying. When DeSantis calls critical race theory racist, he is in fact exercising racism because he is concerned that any theory or any discussion of the history of America that recognizes white supremacy or white privilege is in some way racist against white folks. So this concept that whenever someone calls CRT racist, if you should read that as, I am, as a white person, afraid of the conversation about white supremacy. I am, as a white person, unprepared to talk about white privilege, or unwilling to talk about white privilege or recognize the existence of systemic racism. Whenever you hear someone say of CRT that it is racist or it is Marxist, it's really giving you an inkling of what about their own personal worldview is most endangered by CRT. If they call it Marxist, then the part of their worldview that is endangered by CRT is this idea that identity is singular and not in any way dependent upon your surroundings. If they call it racist, then the aspect of their identity that is most in danger is the white aspect of their identity and the parts of their life that have been privileged by their whiteness. All right. Some exit questions that I have to ruminate on. So for the final question for lunch is, how can you dispel myths about CRT and intersectionality in your own circle of friends and acquaintances? I would suggest sending people to the links on the next page. And then when we do disruptive work, how can we do so without creating a barrier for dialogue with those who don't yet understand or even believe in systemic racism? I don't think there are really any easy answers for that, but I think they're worth trying to figure out. And finally, some further reading and listening. Kimberle Crenshaw's TED Talk, which is 18 minutes long. You will cry. It's really, really amazing. And then Bell Hooks on cultural criticism and transformation is 6 minutes long. The American Bar Association's A Lesson on Critical Race Theory is really wonderful and fairly concise. It's about 5 pages long. I'm going to drop all of these links in the description on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. And I came in just under 30 minutes. I said an understanding of this stuff in less than 30 minutes. So hopefully you have some understanding of this debate. Thanks so much. Have a good one. Bye.